Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. Michael Oren served as Israel's ambassador to the United States between 2009 and 2013. As ambassador, he was instrumental in securing U.S. support for Israel's defense and upholding Israel's right to security. His current role isn't all that much different. After October 7th, he launched the Israel Advocacy Group, which has worked to strengthen diplomatic relations for the Jewish state and support Israelis during wartime. Ambassador Oren is with us now to explain the challenge Israelis are now facing. Ambassador Oren, welcome to People of the Pod.
Good to be with you, Manya.
Ambassador, you are touring the U.S. with residents of northern Israel who've been displaced by near-daily attacks from Hezbollah terrorists across the border with Lebanon. As we speak, Israel is conducting a military operation in Beirut. Can you tell us what is happening and why?
Okay, let me begin by saying that Israel has not taken credit from the pager and walkie-talkie attacks, has not. And so we want to avoid that type of symmetry because, on one hand, Hezbollah is very proud of the fact that they're firing hundreds of rockets and hundreds of explosive drones at civilians in Israel. Literally, Israel's not taking that credit. So let's begin with this. October 8th, a day after the horrendous Hamas assault on southern Israel, Hezbollah, out of avowed desire to show solidarity with Hamas, opened fire on northern Israel. To date, about 10,000 rockets, explosive drones have been fired at Galilee. It began along the immediate border, some 18 communities along the immediate border, but it creeped downward now where rockets are falling along the Sea of Galilee, which is in southern Galilee, and moving its way toward Haifa and the suburbs of Haifa, moving westward. 100,000 Israelis have been rendered homeless. Tens of thousands of acres of farmland, forest land have been incinerated. Thousands of houses have been destroyed, and dozens of people have been wounded and killed as well, civilians as well as military. The entire north has been transformed into a war zone. Cities that you know, like Kiryat Shmona, Metula, are ghost towns today. One of the members of our delegation, her home was rocketed in Metula yesterday. It is the 215th home destroyed by Hezbollah in that once beautiful, beautiful town of Metula. So that's the objective situation. It's an utterly, utterly unprovoked attack on the land and the people of Israel. And Israel, of course, has to defend itself. The great complaint among the people of the north is that the state has not done enough to defend the people of the north. And so any actions now taken, including last night, where Israeli warplanes were attacking Hezbollah emplacements and targets, not just in southern Lebanon, but throughout Lebanon, is very much welcomed by the people of the north, though they have yet to see how the state intends to return them and store them to their homes. I'll just add one more point that is widely misunderstood in this country. There's a notion that somehow if a ceasefire is attained with Hamas in Gaza, which is highly, highly unlikely, but if it is attained, then Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, said he too will accept a ceasefire. But a ceasefire will restore the status quo ante of October 6th. And Israelis simply won't go back to their homes if the situation that obtained on October 6th, where Hezbollah was exactly on the opposite side of the fence, no one's going back to communities that are opposite side of the fence. Because now we know what terrorists can do to Israelis on the other side of that fence, our side of the fence. So there is really no alternative but to drive Hezbollah back. It's to drive them back beyond the Litani River, which meanders opposite our northern border between 13 and 20 kilometers. There's a diplomatic initiative by American Special Envoy Amos Hochstein to try to convince Hezbollah to retroactively implement Resolution 1701 of the Security Council. It's from 2006. It called on Hezbollah to withdraw north of the Litani River. Hezbollah never accepted it. Hezbollah violates it daily, flagrantly. I wish Mr. Hochstein all the best of luck. I don't know what leverage he can bring to bear to convince Hezbollah to implement 1701. But barring that, Israel will have absolutely no choice to push Hezbollah back physically from that fence.
In fact, returning residents home to their homes in northern Israel has become a war goal. The cabinet has just announced that this week, right?
Well, it's about time. It's about 11 months too late.
So I guess what does that mean? Does that mean that this conflict with Hezbollah or Lebanon could escalate?
Oh, I would expect it would escalate, yes, and that we have to be prepared for any scenario, including an all-out war. Now, an all-out war is no small thing. It's a war that's many times more severe than that with Hamas in the south. First of all, Hezbollah is one of the largest military forces anywhere, not just in the Middle East. It's got upwards of 170,000 rockets hidden under villages, under hundreds of villages. It has a fighting force of terrorists that's 3, 4 times that of Hamas. It has cyber capabilities, and it's not just Hezbollah. It's the Shiite militias that are backed by Iran in Iraq and Syria, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. We know that they can fire at Israel well. And there's Iran itself. Iran, which on April 14th launched 315 rockets at Israel. So the IDF estimate for rocket fire per day in any war with Hezbollah could reach as much as 10,000 rockets a day. And that will overwhelm our multi-tiered anti-missile system. We will require assistance from the United States. And even then, it'll be quite a challenge.
As you mentioned, this is all happening simultaneously with the war against Hamas in Gaza. Yes, Houthis also are firing rockets, one of which, I think at least one, reached or almost reached central Israel just this past week. I mean, how many fronts is Israel fighting on right now? And could this escalate? Could that number of fronts grow even more?
Well, right now we're at about 7 fronts, according to the defense minister's calculation. So what is it? It is the north. It is the south. It is the Houthis very much to the south, but are capable of firing into Tel Aviv. It is the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank front, which is very severe indeed. So that's just the bottom line of the fronts we're firing. We're also fighting a front against Iran, more distantly, against the Shiite and militias in Iraq and Syria. So a multiple front war. And make no mistake about it, this is an existential struggle for the state of Israel.
And you said that returning to October 6th, or what the status was on October 6th, is now not acceptable. I mean, was there a short window of time where that was what the wish and the hope was, and that has shifted?
I think it was lost on October 7th. So if you were to go to Metula on October 6th, you could stick your hand through the fence. I wouldn't recommend you do this. You could stick your hand through the fence and you would touch Hezbollah. They're right there. And the people of Metula and other communities along that border simply won't go back under those circumstances. And you can understand why. I don't know if you have young children. I don't think you'd put your children in a house that's looking at Hezbollah across from a fence. Now we know what the terrorists can do to Israeli families, civilians, women, babies who are on the other side of a fence. And a fence is no guarantee against any assault. The people from the north also believe that there are still tunnels under that fence, that we haven't discovered all of the Hezbollah tunnels. There are people in our delegation from the north who believe that Hezbollah still has tunnels that have not been detected under that fence, because Hamas digs its tunnels in sand, Hezbollah digs its tunnels in rock, and they're deeper and harder to detect.
You said that you wondered if I have small children. I do. I have 2 small children. We go to, well, they're getting less small by the day, but it made me think of a column that you wrote back in March for the Forward about how Jews are cursed to be a lonely people. And I actually gave a speech to our synagogue congregation just last week talking about how I was so grateful to be part of a congregation on October 6th, celebrating Simchat Torah, when I woke up on October 7th, because otherwise I would have felt, and my children would have felt, so alone. And I am curious where you were on October 7th and how you have combated that loneliness, that lonely feeling.
Well, I had an unusual experience. On October 5th, I was giving a speech in Dallas, Texas. And the speech was interesting because at the end of my remarks, I told the audience that I believe that Israel would soon be going to war. And everyone gasped. And I'd actually been briefing foreign diplomatic personnel about this for about 2 weeks. And the reason I thought Israel was going to war was because of the divisions within Israeli society, the divisions within American societies that Iranians were following very, very closely. But the most important point was that the United States was trying to broker a peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And as part of that deal, Saudi Arabia was going to get nuclear power. And my line was that if anybody thought that the Iranians would sit quietly while the Saudis got nuclear power, they were kidding themselves, and the Iranians would start a war. All right, I had other information, but that was the major thrust. So 2 days later, I was coming back to Israel. I was stopping off at my mother's house in New Jersey. Woke up to the messages you never want to receive on your cell phone, which is, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?" And learned about this. Now, for many years, through the generosity of the Singer Foundation, whenever there's a national emergency, I'm immediately put on television. So starting on the morning of October 7th, I was on CNN, MSNBC, throughout the day, called some friends in El Al and got myself on the first flight out of Newark that night and landed in a war zone the next morning and went immediately to work. So around a small kitchen table in my house, a group of volunteers together formed an emergency NGO called the Israel Advocacy Group. Because what can I say? The state wasn't doing a particularly excellent job in defending itself in the media and other forums. What began as a small sort of a mom and pop operation around the kitchen table has now become the Israel Advocacy Group, IAG, dealing with international media, mainstream, non-mainstream, and with track to diplomacy. So track to diplomacy is what we're doing in Washington now by bringing the delegations to the Hill. We've had meetings on the Hill with both parties, both houses, and today we're in the White House. So we've gone to the White House twice with these delegations. That's track to diplomacy. And so it's a big undertaking. So my way of dealing with the loneliness is certainly joining with other people, especially young people who are committed to defending Israel in every possible forum. I'm very blessed because I'm a member of a community in Jaffa, a Kehillah, which is just wonderful. And of course, the family, Tammy, my beloved, and children and grandchildren, 6.5 and counting.
You are heading up this Israel Advocacy Group. That's post-October 7th. But before October 7th, you had started a think tank. I don't know if you would call it an advocacy group. I've been calling it a think tank called Israel 2048. You also wrote a book titled 2048, The Rejuvenated State. It was published in one single volume in English, Hebrew, and Arabic, very, very symbolically. And I'm curious if this vision that you laid out for the next century of the Jewish state, is it stalled by all of this?
So, first of all, on 2048, it was a project that grew out of my time in Knesset, and I was the deputy in the prime minister's office, and sort of realizing that Israel is so bogged down in its daily crises. Little do we know what a daily crisis was, that we never really think about our future. And the goal was to envision the Jewish state on its 100th birthday. Our 100th birthday would be 2048, and how can we assure a second successful century? What changes had to be made in the state of Israel? And they're pretty big, far-reaching changes. And it began as a discussion group online. We had a 2048 seminar at the Hartman Institute with Natan Sharansky for about a year. Then COVID hit and retreated to the room and wrote this book. It's an 80-page manifesto that covers 22 aspects of Israeli society. It's educational policy, social policy, health policy, foreign policy, Israel diaspora relations, of course, the U.S.-Israel relations, and the peace process. Certainly the largest section on the peace process and our relationship with Israeli Arabs, the Haredi issue, the ultra-Orthodox issue, the Bedouin issue. It's all in 80 quick pages. And the idea of the book was to sort of spur conversation, especially among young people within Israel and in the United States, elsewhere in the diaspora, in the way Zionist thinkers used to think about the future Jewish state starting in the 1880s up to the 1940s. A huge literature on what this Jewish state was going to look like. And we seem to have lost the ability to have that sort of broad discussion about our future. And it was going very, very well, the discussion. It was not a think tank. It was actually an anti-think tank. I didn't want to produce any papers. I just wanted to have discussions when the war broke out. Looking back at this book now, it is actually a better seller now than it was before the war because many of the problems that were revealed by the war were anticipated by the book. And it's actually more crucial now than ever before. You know, Manya, I'm often asked, what wars does this war most resemble? Is it the 67 war where we were surrounded by enemies? Is it the 73 war when we were surprised by our enemies? But truly, the war that most resembles this one is the War of Independence, where we are fighting on multiple fronts in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and everybody's in the army, and at a tremendous, tremendous cost. So really, we're in a second Israel War of Independence. And that's the bad news. The good news is we get to rebuild afterward the way we rebuilt post-1948. I don't know any other manifesto that sets out the goals which we have to strive if we're going to have a successful second war of independence. Certainly, we have to address the Haredi issue. It's not sustainable. We have to address the Bedouin issue. The IDF secured the release of one of the hostages several weeks ago, a Bedouin gentleman. It was an extraordinary event, definitely praiseworthy. But that Bedouin had two wives and had settled illegally on state land, and that's it was indicative of the type of problems we face with the Bedouin that no one's addressing. But it's also our education system. How can we proceed on a road to some type of better relationship with the Palestinians? How can we maintain unity within the Jewish world? Everything from the Kotel to teaching math on a high school level in a Haredi school.
How dismaying that there are so many wars to choose from for comparison. But I appreciate the one that the analogy that you've made and the hope that carries with it. So, Ambassador Oren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And let me say Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
And I also want to give a special thank you to the American Jewish Committee. Yesterday morning, under the aegis of the AJC, our delegation of displaced Northerners met with about 20 representatives of the diplomatic community here in Washington, including the German ambassador, the Czech ambassador, the Slovakian ambassador, diplomats from Spain, Italy. And for the first time, this diplomatic community was able to hear firsthand what it is to live under daily Hezbollah rocket and drone fire and to be displaced from their homes. And it was extremely important. We're very, very grateful to AJC.
Ambassador Oren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for my conversation with two proud Jewish Paralympians on how sports can unite athletes amid anti-Semitism, which surfaced during the Paris 2024 Olympic Games. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.